This is Keeper of the Lost Cities, Chapter 1, Book 1. Miss Foster. Mr. Sweeney's nasal voice cut through Sophie's blaring music as he yanked her earbuds out by the cords. Have you decided that you're too smart to pay attention to this information? Sophie forced her eyes open. She tried not to wince as the bright fluorescence reflected off the vivid blue walls of the museum, amplifying the throbbing headache she was hiding. No, Mr. Sweeney, she mumbled, shrinking under the glares of her now staring classmates. She pulled her shoulder-length blonde hair around her face, wishing she could hide behind it. This was exactly the kind of attention she went out of her way to avoid. Why, she wore dull colors and lurked in the back, blocked by the other kids who were at least a foot taller than her. It was the only way to survive as a 12-year-old high school student. Then perhaps you can explain why you were listening to your iPod instead of following along. Mr. Sweeney held up her earbuds like they were evidence in a crime, though to him they probably were. He dragged Sophie's class to the Natural History Museum in Balboa Park, assuming his students would be excited about the all-day field trip. He didn't seem to realize that unless the giant dinosaur replicas came to life and started eating people, no one cared. Sophie tugged out a loose eyelash, a nervous habit, and stared at her feet. There was no way to make Mr. Sweeney understand why she needed the music to cancel the noise. He couldn't even hear the noise. Chatter from dozens of tourists echoed off the fossil-lined walls and splashed around the carnivorous room. But the mental voices were the real problem. Scattered, disconnected pieces of thought broadcast straight into Sophie's brain, like being in a room with hundreds of TVs blaring different shows at the same time. They sliced into her concussedness, leaving sharp pains in their wake. She was a freak. It had been her secret, her burden, since she fell and hit her head when she was 5 years old. She tried blocking the noises, tried ignoring it. Nothing helped, and she could never tell anyone. They wouldn't understand. Since you've decided you're above the lecture, why don't you give it? Mr. Sweeney asked. He pointed to the omnivorous orange dinosaur with a duck bill in the center of the room. Explain to the class why the Lambeosaurus differs from the other dinosaurs we've studied. Sophie pressed aside as her mind flashed to an image of the information card in the front of the display. She glanced at it when they entered the museum, and her photographic memory recorded every detail. As she recited the facts, Mr. Sweeney's face twisted into a scowl, and she could hear her classmates' thoughts growing intensely sour. They weren't exactly fans of their resident child prodigy. They called her Curve Buster. She finished her answer, and Mr. Sweeney grumbled something that sounded like know-it-all. As he stalked off to the exhibit in the next room, Sophie didn't follow. The thin walls separating the two rooms didn't block the noise, but they muffled it. She grabbed what little relief she could. Nice job, super freak, Garwin Chang, a boy wearing a t-shirt that said, "Back off, I'm gonna fart," sneered as he shoved past her to join their classmates. "Maybe I'll write another article on you. Child prodigy teaches class about the Lamosaurus." Garwin was still better. Yale offered her a full-ride scholarship. His rejection letter had arrived a few weeks before. Not that Sophie was allowed to go. Her parents said it was too much attention, too much pressure, and she was too young. End of discussion. So she had attended a much closer, much smaller San Diego City College next year. A fact some annoying reporter found newsworthy enough to post in the local paper the day before child prodigy chooses City College over Ivy League. Local paper the day before. Child prodigy chooses City College over Ivy League. Complete with her senior photo, her parents freaked when they found out. Freaked wasn't even a strong enough word. More than half the rules were to help Sophie avoid unnecessary attention. Front page articles were pretty much their worst nightmare. They'd even called the newspaper to complain. The editor seemed as unhappy as they were. The story was run in place of an article on the arsonists terrorizing the city, and they were still trying to figure out how this mistake had happened. Bizarre fires with white-hot flames and smoke that smelled like burnt sugar took priority over everything, especially a story about an unimportant little girl most people went out of their way to ignore, or they used to. Across the museum, Sophie caught a sight of a tall, dark-haired boy reading yesterday's newspaper, with the embarrassing black and white photo of her on the front. Then he looked up and stared straight at her. She'd never seen eyes that particular shade of blue before. Teal, like the smooth piece of sea glass she'd found on the beach, and they were so bright they glittered. Something flickered across his expression when he caught her gaze. Disappointment? Before she could decide what to make of it, he shrugged off the display he'd been leaning against and closed the distance between them. The smile he flashed belonged on a movie screen, and Sophie's heart did a weird fluttery thing. "This you?" he asked, pointing to the picture. Sophie nodded, feeling tongue-tied. He was probably 15 and by far the cutest boy she had ever seen. So why was he talking to her? "I thought so." He squinted at the picture, then back at her. "I didn't realize your eyes were brown." "Oh, yeah," she said. "I'm not sure what to say." She said, not sure what to say. "Why?" He shrugged. "No reason." Something felt off about the conversation, but she couldn't figure it out. What it was, and she couldn't place his accent, kind of British, but different somehow, crisper, more, which bothered her, but she didn't know why. "Are you in this class?" she asked, wishing she could suck the words back as soon as they left her mouth. So of course he wasn't in her class. She'd never seen him before. She wasn't used to talking to boys, especially cute boys, and it made her brain a little mushy. His perfect smile returned as he told her no. Then he pointed to the hulking greenish figure they were standing in front of, an Albertosaurus in its giant lizard-esque glory. "Tell me something. Do you really think that's what they look like? It's a little absurd, isn't it?" "Not really," Sophie said, trying to see what he saw. It looked like a small T-Rex, big mouth, sharp teeth, ridiculously short arms. Seemed fine to her. "Why, what do you think they look like?" He laughed. Never mind. I'll let you get back to your class. It was nice meeting you, Sophie." He turned to leave just as two classes of kindergartners barreled into the fossil exhibit. The crushing waves of screaming voices was enough to knock Sophie back a step, but their mental voices were a other realm of pain. Kids' thoughts were stinging high-pitched needles, and so many at once was like an angry porcupine attacking her brain. Sophie closed her eyes and her hands darted to her head, rubbing her temple to ease the stabbing in her skull. Then she remembered she wasn't alone. She glanced around to see if anyone noticed her reaction and locked eyes with the boy. His hands were at his forehead, and his face wore the same pained expression she imaged. She had only a few seconds before. "Did you just hear that?" he asked. His voice hushed. She felt the blood drain from her face. He couldn't mean. It had to be the screaming kids. They created plenty of racket on their own, shrieks and squeals, giggles, plus 60 or so individual voices clattering away. Voices? She gasped and took another step back. Her brain solved her earlier problem. She could hear the thoughts of everyone in the room, but she couldn't hear the boy's distinct accented voice unless he was speaking. His mind was totally and completely silent. She didn't know that was possible. "Who are you?" she whispered. His eyes widened. "You did, didn't you?" He moved closer, leaning in to whisper, "Are you a telepath?" She flinched. The word made her skin itch, and her reaction gave her away. "You are. I can't believe it," he whispered. Sophie backed towards the exit. She wasn't about to reveal her secret to a total stranger. "It was okay," he said, holding out his hand as he moved closer like she was some sort of wild animal. He was trying to calm. Like she was some sort of wild animal he was trying to calm. "You don't have to be afraid. I'm one too." Sophie froze. "My name's Fitz," he added, stepping closer. Still, what kind of name was Fitz? She studied his face, searching for some sign that this was all part of a joke. "I'm not joking," he said, like he knew exactly what she was thinking. Maybe he did. She wobbled on her feet. She'd spent the past 7 years wishing she could find someone else like her, someone who could do what she could. Now that she found him, she felt like the world had tilted sideways. He grabbed her arm to steady her. "It's okay, Sophie. I'm here to help you. We've been looking for you for 12 years. 12 years. And what did he mean by we? Better question, what did he want with her?" The walls closed in and the room started to spin. Air. She needed air. She jerked away from them and bolted through the door, stumbling as her shaky legs found their rhythm. She sucked in giant breaths as she ran down the stairs in front of the museum. The smoke of the fires burnt her lungs, and white bits of ash flew in her face, but she ignored them. She wanted as much space between her and the strange boy as possible. "Sophie, come back," Fitz shouted behind her. She picked up her pace as she raced through the country yard. At the base of the steps, past the wide fountain and over the grassy knolls to the sidewalk. No one got in her way. Everyone was inside because of the poor air quality, but she could still hear footsteps gaining on her. "Wait," Fitz called. "You don't have to be afraid." She ignored him, pouring all her energy into her sprint and fighting the urge to glance over her shoulder and see how far back he was. She made it halfway through the crosswalk before the sound of screeching tires reminded her she hadn't looked both ways. Her head turned as she looked she locked eyes with the terrified driver, struggling to stop his car before it plowed right over her. She was going to die. End of chapter 1.